All right. Welcome, everyone. So glad that you all are here with us. As you all are joining in, feel free to still say hello, drop that in the chat, say hi, tell us where you're joining from. So glad that you could be here. We've got some folks from Northern California. Hello, hello to our neighbors. Good morning from Seattle. Hello, some Seattleites joining in. So I love that. We're going to just dive right in because we've got so much to cover today. And I am just really excited to have these amazing guests on the line with me. So, just to introduce myself, my name is Andrea G. Tatum. I am the CEO of AGT Diversity Consulting, which I started last year in the middle of a pandemic. Why not? But really, I started this business because I was hearing from lots of people who said, I want to learn more about what diversity, equity, and inclusion is and what would a career in DEI possibly look like, and is that for me? And a lot of times they were coming to me frustrated or saying like, hey, can I just pick your brain about that transition that you made? And so I'm not going to spend a ton of time about me, but my transition was, from working in nonprofit arts, working in theater, working in marketing, to fast forward, working in tech, working as a project manager, working in events, and then pivoted into a full-time role in diversity, equity, and inclusion. But along the way, that entire time throughout my career, I was always doing DEI work, even though I never had that title. So I really wanted to take the opportunity to create this business to help educate people about, one, how to use your own sphere of influence to impact DEI work, and how to also make sure that you're assessing the right role for you if you are really interested. So I'll tell you all a little bit more about my business towards the end and how you all can connect with me through my courses and my career coaching. But welcome again to everybody. If you're just joining, say hello in the chat. Tell us where you're joining from. And I'm going to actually have my panelists start to introduce themselves. And what I'm going to ask each panelist to do is tell us about you, tell us about your current role, and how did you end up in the position that you're in now? And so I'm going to actually start with Ashley. I'm going to go in alphabetical order today, starting with first name. So Ashley, why don't you give us a start, and welcome and thank you again for being here.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm Ashley Russell. Pronouns are she and her. Born and raised in Seattle, Washington, and identify as a Black woman. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to approach the question a little bit differently and take you all through my kind of DEI journey, which started when I was actually quite young. I just didn't realize it. I thought I was just doing good work for my community and doing good work that not only fulfilled me, but also really helped flourish, those who look like me and for those who didn't look like me. So as part of my professional career, I started at AT&T, being a regional program manager. And on the side, as part of my volunteer work, I led our Aspire Mentoring Academy. And in that work, I continued my community engagement and found more joy in working with folks from the Boys and Girls Club, from organizations that really were dedicated to providing resources and tools and an outlet for those from underrepresented communities. And I realized at that point I really wanted to pivot, and so I moved to a nonprofit organization similar to you, Andrea, and I worked for several years at Year Up, where I work with young people from, again, underrepresented communities, and we train them in a variety of technical skills. And I served as kind of the conduit to provide those students with access to internships at major corporations. And unfortunately, at that time, my students would come back to me and say, Ashley, I don't feel like I belong there. I don't feel included. I don't feel valued. What do I do? And so I also really dedicated my time during my role at Europe to leading our diversity, equity, and inclusion committee, and wanting to focus on making sure that my students, especially those from Black and Brown communities, really had the support and guidance that they needed to really flourish in these organizations. And then in the words of Karen Fleshman, I decided too, towards the end of my time there, that I wanted to change the corporations to make sure that they fit for young people of color versus changing young people of color to fit the corporations. And so after that, I transitioned to working at Nordstrom, leading our diversity strategy there, and now doing the same at Amazon, and wanting to share with you all today that the common thread throughout my career has been wanting to provide access to opportunity, and wanting to help you all in whatever way I can, to let you know that you can follow a similar path as mine, or not a similar path as mine, and you can still get to the goal that you want. It may take time, and as long as you're willing to put in the time, you will get there.
Thank you so much, Ashley. I love that. And before everybody joined onto the webinar, I was telling the rest of the panelists that Ashley and I met through a mutual connection because of Europe. And during some of my time at Tableau, I had the opportunity to volunteer there and to speak and to just provide information to some of the youth who are participating about like, what does tech life look like and what does it mean to work in these big tech companies? And it was just such a fulfilling opportunity. And I just want to give a little nod and shout out to Europe. If it's an organization you're not familiar with, I highly recommend that you just check it out, learn more about it, as they're doing some really phenomenal work. So thank you for that, Ashley. So I'm going to hop over to Dan. And Dan, if you want to give a little intro, tell us about you and your journey into the work that you do.
Sure. Well, thank you and greetings, everyone. It's lovely to be here with you virtually. My name is Dan or Danny Egol. I use he and him pronouns, and I am based in Washington, D.C. I grew up in a multicultural home. So my mom's family is Cuban and my dad's family is Jewish and from Eastern Europe. And so having multiple languages at home, multiple cultural connections to different parts of the world from a very young age made me really question, where is home? What does community look and feel like, particularly when people who I'm closest to, perhaps relationally, live on the other side of the planet in some cases, and having family members on either side of my family who actually cannot speak to each other because they don't have a shared language. And so for me, I had no concept around language of DE and I. It was just something that I was naturally gravitating towards in terms of my lived experience. And when I went to college, I was very fortunate to go to a small liberal arts college in Vermont named Middlebury College, which my grandparents called Blueberry College, and that's fine. But one of the things I think was most powerful about my time there was that I graduated in 2013, and my class year was the first school's year in over 200 years of history where the students who came from public school, including myself, was in the same representation of students from private schools. And the school's tuition at that time was close to, I think, about $55,000, $60,000, and I'm sure is more now. And so by virtue of being on any financial aid in the school, you were in the small minority of students because only a third of students received any sort of financial aid to go to school there. And so I began to understand class in a very different way. And it was actually my 3 work-study jobs that I had while I was at school that really put me on this path to doing this work in a formal way, even though I still didn't have language for even knowing that this is a professional path that I could pursue. So I worked at the admissions office on campus for all 4 years and began to understand institutional gatekeeping and selection processes. I worked at the Americans with Disabilities Act office, providing disability accommodations and services to students who have disabilities. And as other than my glasses, I identify someone who's currently able-bodied. So that also really opened my world. And I did academic research at a center on campus that was focused explicitly on race and ethnicity. And so the combination of those things, plus my interests in personal life, started to naturally, I think, pull me towards this world. And I was very fortunate while at school to have a professor who said, you need to go work at this organization in DC that I know about, let me connect you. And of course, it's one of the many privileges of going to schools like that is the relational aspect of what opportunities become accessible to you. And it was a DEI consulting firm called Cook Ross in Washington, DC. And so that's where I had my first 5 years of professional life. It was where I learned to see this work as a discipline and to see it be implemented in lots of different kinds of organizations. And I'll say briefly now, and we can talk about it more over the course of our conversation, that time really informed the work that I do today as the executive director of a new nonprofit called Inclusion NextWork, or INW, whose mission is to connect, support, and elevate the next generation of leaders who are doing DEI work. And so we do that through leadership and community development work, as well as by providing young folks with hands-on paid professional development opportunities through the form of consulting projects. So we support a number of nonprofits across the country doing this work and have avenues for people to learn, from one another, to learn from experts in the field, and actually to use opportunities like this to get their hands in the field, so that as you're looking for jobs and people are saying you must have 12 years of experience and those jobs didn't exist at those organizations 12 years ago, you at least can have tangible things to say. And I may not have been a DEI manager or ERG leader, but I've done assessments, I've helped facilitate focus groups, I've helped develop strategy, I've worked on coaching models and training and facilitation. And so I'm more than happy to talk about those things and other aspects over the course of today, and I'm grateful for the time. But I want to turn things over so you all get to hear from Rohini too.
Thank you so much, Dan. And yes, and so I definitely, I recommend checking out Inclusion NextWork. Even with the work that I do in wanting to support people who are interested in getting into DEI, I love what Inclusion NextWork is doing, and have been really excited to partner with them, and have been on some panels and attended some of their events, and just really love the conversations and work that they are bringing to other young people who are working in wanting to work inside of this space. So thank you so much for that, Dan, and taking us on your journey. And with that, I want to also introduce Rohini and bring her to the table, my virtual stage today. So tell us all about your journey, and kind of a little bit about the work that you're doing now and that pivot that you've made recently.
Yes. So the pronouns I use is she and her. And I was born in India, and teen years is when I moved to US. And that's really when my journey of being lost started, being an immigrant and coming to US. And when I started going into college and corporate world, I was in limbo. And I was surviving. To survive, I became a yes person. And through that, there's this word that comes for me, dignity was lost. So when I was in the corporate world, I've noticed that there were similar stories to mine, and organically I started pivoting towards voices being heard. And it was just a very simple, small act of putting panels together. If there was an offsite, working with leaders and saying, hey, I would love to have a panel, can I have a platform for stories to be heard? So that was the first step. The second step was finally when I got a seat at the table, this analogy of Thanksgiving, you're getting an invitation to Thanksgiving, but you're told you get to sit at the kids' table versus the adult table. That's exactly what it felt like. When I was in the room, it was almost like go sit at the kids' table. For me, the big word is respect, lack of, when you're finally in the room. And organically, the program of mentoring, coaching, and making sure there's allyships and advocates to make sure there was an even field for everybody in the room started. And that work organically started for me when I was in corporate world. Last but not least is often when I was working with leaders, because I was a people partner, I would see unfairness. Leaders that have connections, their kids would get internships automatically, or get the platform to follow someone and learn more. And for me, the word fairness sticks out, and that was really deep rooted for me. So programs around first generation college students organically started for me in corporation, and incorporating that in the processes and systems. As I was doing that, the pull towards DEI was happening, and I started working with corporations on establishing and making the sad word business case. I shouldn't be a business case of why it's an essential breathing element for an organization. And the pivot happened to me just starting my own organization called Arcus Consulting. So I do ERG coaching, executive coaching, but also do DEI consultation, and really making sure companies are weaving in their values and their DNA to their DEI, and not just copycatting. Like, I like what that organization did, I'm going to take that and slap it onto my DEI strategy. That is not how it works. People are different, leaders are different, the cultural aspect of it, the global aspect of it. So I do a lot of work on DEI strategy and making sure that it speaks, it has a voice, and it is unique to the organization. And it's really focusing on the systems and processes.
I love it. And you just said something that just made me kind of want to just kind of dig into that a little bit more, which is this idea that, right, like the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion is not one size fits all. Right. Oftentimes people say, oh, we have to have ERGs, we have to have this group, we have to do this thing because we see these other companies who are doing it. And you see oftentimes like what's pushed via social media, because that's actually what companies are willing to even put out there, versus the other thing that you mentioned, which is the strategy, the actual strategic approach that it takes to make real change inside of those organizations. That's oftentimes happening behind the scenes. The reason you're being asked for a business case, the process of creating that strategy, all of that is oftentimes not what's being told, the story that's being told. And so a lot of times in the work that we do, the thing that is a change isn't necessarily the most like glamorous thing that's ever happened. And sometimes it is. But I'd love to maybe start with you, Rohini, to talk about, because it's not always so glamorous or it's not always social media appropriate, maybe what's one thing that in the course of your career and thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion work that you're most proud of that you've been able to accomplish?
I would say the biggest example that comes to me is giving a voice to the voiceless.
Mm.
That was very, very important to me, and that's what I'm most proud of. And you were absolutely right. It was work that I did behind the scenes. No one saw me as the voice. It was everybody that was on the stage and their stories that they saw the voice of. So it was a program called Hear Our Voices, and it was a story of each employee from different demographic, different ethnicity, different economic status that they were able to share. And what it created was a humanistic connection, which we forget. And ultimately, that's the goal of DEI. We are all human, and there's that connection that we need to embrace. And the reason I'm really proud of is the biggest lesson that I've learned from it is really listen to understand. Listen to the stories, listen to the pain. It's not about you. It's about really hearing that voice and listening to understand. I had an aha moment, and I know many others did, and that was the proudest program, I think, that I will always remember.
Thank you for sharing that. Same question for you, Ashley. In the course of your journey, what's something that you can say that you're most proud of that you've been able to accomplish?
Yeah, I would say just my ability to really change the culture. I was given the advice at a very young age that I should leave my fingerprints on the business wherever I go. And as you heard from my introduction, I've been to several places over the years. And so I've kind of carried that along with me. And so my driver has been knowing that even the small changes that I'm able to implement will have long lasting change and effect way, way after I leave the organization. And what I know is that I'm helping to build an inclusive and equitable workplace for those who look like me, those from marginalized communities, and for all employees, right? Because once we fix it for the most marginalized, we fix it for everyone, right? And so I really enjoy just being able to be the catalyst for change for the many organizations I've been a part of, whether they want to, you know, um, see it as that or not, because it, like you all mentioned, there's no one size fits all approach. It's going to take some time to really make huge improvements. But for me, it's making those small shifts, those small changes, and knowing that it just feels different in the company and within the organization I'm in, I'm super proud of. And so it's not necessarily something that I can attach to one thing or one program. It's just a feeling that I feel like I'm able to implement wherever I go.
No, I totally get that. And I feel that I often call them my tiny wins. I don't know. I think it was somewhere along the way, reading some magazine, it was like celebrate the tiny wins. And that just really resonated with me. And sometimes in the work, you're having to kind of take a dual path if you will, right? Like you've got these big systemic changes and policies that you're really trying to change, and that takes time. It does not happen, at just the flick of a switch. You've got to go through legal, go through processes, but then sometimes it feels like the work is being stalled because, again, right, like it's not out in the forefront. But to your point, sometimes those small things, those tiny wins that you can communicate out broadly and talk about, make it feel like the work is continuous. So it is sometimes this duality that has to happen in order for the work to continue to grow and for people to feel invested in it.
Right.
Because it's very easy to say, well, if I don't see it, I don't believe it's actually happening. But those sometimes tiny wins can feel like they're moving mountains for some people, because you just never know how something very small can really impact someone in a huge way.
Right, because everyone has their own aha moment, like Rohini mentioned, and but you don't know when it will happen, or you don't know what's the one thing that'll actually cause it to happen in folks. And so exactly for me, if it's one individual at a time that makes them open their eyes, have that social awakening that now is the time to really, really take care of your people, no matter what background they're from, is really important to me.
Yeah. And Dan, I'm gonna, you can answer this too, but I want to pivot into a second question, and if you want to weave this in. But I mean, because of the work that you do, and obviously you all work with a lot of aspiring, and you all use the word ideas, which I really, really love the word ideas, that acronym. I'm sure you often get people who are like, can I pick your brain? Can I ask you questions? I want to know more about this work. And in your career and having kind of been in that consulting world and then, working in these different variety of things, what is something that you would say, what is something you often share with people who are saying like, I want to make this transition, who want to pick your brain about what does it mean to get into this work?
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. It's a great question. And actually, as I was thinking about my answer to your first question, I'm glad that they both will hopefully apply.
Yeah.
And just for folks who are listening in, IDEAS is the acronym we use for inclusion, diversity, equity, access, and social justice. For us, we want to make sure that particularly acknowledging the disability rights and liberation movement that we're talking about, that aspect of the conversation, which we feel like is most often left out, but also in a broad interpretation of what access means, access in terms of what language we're using. We're obviously having this conversation in English, but there are perhaps languages that would be more comfortable or preferred for us to do that. We're connecting via technology, so do people have the infrastructure and ability to use technology? We're working across multiple time zones on this call, so is there time access depending on where we are in our days? So for us, that's really important. And as Rohini mentioned earlier, yes, certain organizations may be doing this work because there is a financial impact, but for us, it's about creating a society that's more just. And so we want to make that pretty explicit. So with all that said, when people ask me about my work and how to get involved, the thing that for me is most important is the ability to build authentic and sustainable relationships. And I think those are the things that I'm most proud of, both with my own team of colleagues who I work with, as well as the people who participate in our programs. And there's certainly a trade-off between depth of relationship and the amount of relationships you can hold. And so I know that the kind of impact we have may have certain limitations, but I'd rather us build really deep and sustained relationships with fewer organizations and fewer folks, but know that they are having the kind of impact we want, rather than having a very superficial level with a lot of folks, because I don't know how much change I personally or our organization can do collectively in that context. And so the thing that I often say to people is that, and I really love the work of Adrienne Marie Brown about how change has to happen at the speed of trust, that if there's not trust, it's very hard and oftentimes I'd say impossible to actually initiate change at a broader scale if people don't have a base level of respect, safety, trust, and a sense of belonging to do this work. And I also think that the fundamental unit of social change is the relationship, because if we're trying to do this work on our own, to me, that's like anti-social change, because you can't do it on your own. And so for us, it's really about how do you find a sense of understanding within yourself so that you can honestly and authentically connect with others. And when you can use that as an opportunity for collective action, that's where I think change at scale happens. So for me, it's really about how are you connecting with people? How do you understand your own story? Rohini, I love your acknowledgement of the listening for understanding, because I'm always listening for response, because you're moving so fast and you just want to be able to say, yes, I heard you, and this is what I'm thinking now too. But oftentimes when I do that, I miss the fullness and the beauty and the nuance of what's being shared with me. So the ability to really be present and take all that in is so critical.
I love the idea of relationships in this work. I think it's unfortunately really undervalued, the importance of it in so many different ways. And so Ashley, I'd love to talk with you a little bit in terms of the work that you do. Like, I think relationship building and influencing are so big. And in order to influence change, those relationships are really, really necessary. Can you talk a little bit about your experience with, like, how do you go about doing that in the work that you do, build a relationship in order to make influence?
Yeah, I would say I take the time that is needed to build the trust that others have talked about today. And that is more than just one meeting. It's more than just having a one-on-one focused around the deliverables or the action items that we need to meet, or the goals that we need to achieve. It's really working to understand what's underneath, the person that you're speaking to, and doing so in a way that, of course, is comfortable for both parties, but in a way that allows for the trust to be built. And so for me, I also feel as if I'm an internal relationship builder, because I do value the people that I'm connecting with, and the people that I'm learning from and engaging with. And so I would say definitely using questions to better understand folks and where they're coming from and what identities they hold and kind of where they want to go on the journey is key, and doing so right from the start. I've been with Amazon for just about 6 months, and I directly spent time meeting with each of my leaders, meeting with small groups of employees, holding various listening sessions to really understand how my colleagues are feeling, and how they've been coping actually with what's been happening over the past year and a half or so. And so when I do come out with the different programs or initiatives or strategies that I want to implement, people have the trust that they know that I've heard them because I took the time to listen. They know that I took into account their sentiments, what they're hoping to gain from being part of the organization, and hoping that they will see that I'm taking the right steps for us to get there. Again, knowing that it'll take some time. I'm sure folks have heard that this work is not a sprint, but a marathon, right? And it's a journey, and everyone is on this journey at different points of time. And at times you have to meet folks where they are, but also have to be able to push folks, to where you need them to be. And without taking the time to build those relationships, to build that trust, to really find out what's in it for them, what they want to get out of it, and letting them know that you can help them get there is key for me. And I think what has helped me really build those relationships currently and in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we've just got kind of a recurring theme going here around listening. It seems so simple and so basic, but learning how to listen and not listen to respond, in order, listening in order to make real change is so valuable, and allows you to really create those strategies that are based on reality. So and listening comes in a lot of different forms. And so whether that's through surveys or through group sessions, like there's just a lot of different ways. And so when I talk to people who are kind of early in their career in this, and they're like, how do you even know where you should start in terms of a DEI strategy? Like you said, listening in lots of different ways to collect that data allows you to be able to say, well, here's where we really are. So these are the things, versus what we talked about earlier. Well, let's just try to rinse and repeat what someone else is doing, because that may not be the thing that you really need to do. So you hit on something, Ashley, and I just kind of want to, have, and any of you all can kind of come off and talk about this. But let's be really honest. The last year and a half has been challenging it's been one of those years where I think every time you turn on the news, we're in a different crisis, between COVID, between the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery. I mean, what's been going on in Palestine? What's been going on with anti-Asian hate? What's been, like there's just an infinite amount of things that are happening. And oftentimes, when you're doing this work, it impacts the work that you're doing. And I always say, right, like what's going on in the social world has a real impact. How have you all navigated that in both your personal lives as people who do this work and are deeply personally impacted? And how do you then show up to work when you feel all of these things so greatly? So I'll let any of you all kind of start on that one.
Andrea, that's such a good question. And we were kind of having that conversation before we started the panel. For me, if it put a limelight on my vulnerability and showing up and being vulnerable, which also is a lot of emotional energy that you're sharing with the work that you're doing. For me, it started with forgiveness. The forgiveness starts with yourself. We're all learning in the year and a half. This is all new to some of us. This is all touches personal life experiences that some of us have had. So we're all learning. And the reason I say you have to forgive yourself is because you're going to make mistakes. And that is completely okay. And the biggest advice I've gotten in the year and a half is have your cheer champion squad. Preach what you're practicing. Make sure it is different ages, different ethnicities, different life experiences. That squad is really there for you to lean in and for you to really create a brave space and experiment, right? And that's so important. So that's how I survived, the squad being there and making sure I have a brave space that I could go to have these conversations and willing to experiment and forgiving myself if I'm not able to show up and just being honest about it. And I need to step away. I need to step away.
Absolutely. Thank you. Dan, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, similar to Rohini, I think having a community so one of the sort of founding practices or premises of INW is that you need not only a community of practice to do this work well, but also a community of care that has to be really nourishing and restorative, a place where people can understand or at least listen to with empathy your experience and challenges. And so I'm incredibly fortunate that two of my colleagues are actually formally trained in trauma-informed care and psychological safety practices, psychological first aid. One is a trained therapist. And so we offer to our community weekly healing circles that are totally free and available to the public, but are really about how do we process the trauma, the challenges, the frustration, and the feelings that we are going through as a society, knowing that we are all coming to these conversations from various places and with different experiences. And so that to me has been a huge gift, because I will often go to those as just a participant because I'm so grateful for them and I find them personally really restorative. The other thing that for me is really important with our team that also helps me personally is that every meeting we start with a check-in question that rotates for everyone in the team, gets to pick the question they want, and there's no limitation to what can be asked. There's also no expectation that you have to answer the question. But what I mean by that is that, for example, in the days following the murder of George Floyd, the check-in question was, what do you do with your anger? And being able to actually talk about that in a work context, and also talk about how does anger show up for us? How can we support one another as teammates when we are experiencing anger, or whatever the feeling might be? And so I think for me, having a space that is both personal and professional, where those kinds of questions can come to the surface and people can hold space for one another, has been immensely beneficial to me personally and professionally. And I, whether or not these are colleagues that you hold that kind of space with, family members, members of your faith community, friends, colleagues, whatever it is, finding that space where those conversations can come up is really helpful for a number of reasons. First and foremost is that you realize that what you're experiencing is often not being experienced in isolation, that others are experiencing their own version of these events, and that processing in community can be really powerful. But it also, I think, does something to reinforce the bonds, going back to relationships that you build with people, because my team is so much stronger knowing that when Dan is angry, this is what it shows up as. So if he says or does X thing, you can recognize it and therefore you won't take it personally, or vice versa. So there's a lot of real benefits for us, at least, in having that kind of space.
You just said all the things, which is why I always love getting to be in conversation with you. I think holding space is so important. I think in every single one of these that I've ever done, and if you've ever had a conversation with me for longer than 5 minutes, I will talk about the importance of doing this work and protecting your mental health. Like really being able to have those spaces, whether they are in a group session, like what you all are able to host, or if it means finding a therapist or using your EAP that maybe your organization offers, whatever that is, protecting your own personal peace as a DEI professional is so very important, because oftentimes you're seen as kind of the caretaker and the therapist for everybody else, and they are bringing their drama and their trauma to you. And you have to be able to balance that and have a place to be able to place it, because you can't hold it. And I was, if I'm being really transparent, even before we got on the call, we were, hey, how are you? With all the other panels. And I said, I'm tired. I am honestly tired. And I constantly have to ask myself, if I'm going to pour in to other people, what am I doing to pour back into myself? Right? Like I have to be able to have the ability to take care of myself. And part of that self-care is recognizing when I am tired and not just giving a standard answer of I'm good, I'm great, everything's fine, because it's not always, and it's not always just roses. And I think being able to be that kind of transparent and honest is really good for you as well. So that's just kind of my personal thing that I always like to share. Anything else on that? Yeah. Yeah.
Do you mind if I just chime in real quick?
Yeah.
Just what you shared made me remember that one of the other things that's really important for us is, I think, acknowledging where we need support and help, because these roles can often be seen as sort of asymmetrical, that you give and you give and you give, and you don't have space either in the organization, or there's a cultural sort of norm around not asking for help. And so transparency around what you need is so critical. So the last thing I'll just say very quickly is that our organization has a floating mental health day that all employees are required to take once every 2 weeks. So you pick the day, you pick when it happens, but every 10 work days, one of those that you have to take off just to be for yourself. And the sort of corollary to that is that when we are out, our out of office message says that we're taking a mental health day and explains why we're doing that, what it serves, and the importance of it, because we're also trying to destigmatize the fact that asking for help, taking time, and doing the things that you need is a problem, because in fact it's not. And our team's productivity hasn't suffered, our relationships are stronger, and we're taking care of ourselves so that we can do our best work. So for me, I just didn't want to forget that piece, because what you said sparked it for me. Yeah,
no, I really appreciate that. I think especially in the US, we are very bad about how we use our time off. And I know you all have probably seen this meme floating around that's like, hey, I'm out of the office today having, surgery, but you can still catch me on text. Like there's nothing about that kind of having to constantly grind that's normal. Like, but I love that you said, right, like just saying I'm out of the office and it's a mental health day, and that's it. Like that's all that you need to be able to say, and not have to still say, oh, I'm going to work so on my day off. I am so very guilty of that, and consciously working on saying, if I'm off, I'm off, and taking that real time. So with that, we were kind of talking about how you all show up for each other, Dan, in your organization, and how you can do that. But I want to pivot a little bit and thinking about, with your colleagues, with other folks that you work with who maybe aren't working in diversity, equity, and inclusion. What are some ways that people who are maybe on the fence, maybe I want to change over and work in diversity, equity, and inclusion full time, or maybe not, I'm not sure. What are some things that you've seen from people who do not have titles in DEI that they've done to make a real impact in this work? Because I think it's really important that people recognize that regardless of the role that you're in, you can use your sphere of influence to drive diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I just want to talk a little bit about that, and maybe starting with Rohini, what, if any, examples that you may have of where you've seen people, whether it's hiring managers or whatever that may be able to use their sphere of influence to make an impact.
So one of the things that comes up to me is grassroots. You don't have to have an ERG or call it an ERG. It could be a simple gathering where you are celebrating. You have advocates and leaders that are willing to support. This is a purpose-driven work. And if it's tied with your purpose, you have the energy to propel you to do what you want to do. And so I've had employees that went up to leaders and said, we need budget. We would love to celebrate a Diwali festival here. We love to showcase what it is all about. It's as simple as that. Or I have leaders that went up to the executive team and said, guess what? I want to start a women's group. And this women's group is really about coding and giving back. And it's about tech support. It could be, if you're in an organization, let's be real, there's data, use your eyes. You don't need to have a HRIS system spitting out saying, oh, there's a huge gap between a manager and a director. You visibly see it around you. You don't need someone to give you that report. And just having a voice and having your thoughts. And a lot of people say my voice is not heard on a survey. It is heard on a survey. If there is more than 2, it becomes a trend. That's my philosophy. So make sure you're using these platforms to speak up of what you want. And so I've had employees that used their voice on survey to then say, we would like a mentorship program. We would like a coach. And so there was coaching programs internally started by employees. What I'm really trying to say is there's so much you could do. You don't need permission to do it. Just own it and take it and be creative about it and talk to your peers and people outside. And if it's part of your purpose, go ahead. No permission needed. So simple things that you could start with is coaching, is mentorship, is celebrating culturally what you can bring, sharing your stories, having advocates that are willing to do a lot larger work. And so it's all about grassroots.
Yeah, I totally agree. And like every organization's at a different place. And so some of these companies that are at this level of maturity that people kind of seek out, there are still grassroots things happening in that company. Like, don't let the big shiny fool you. The grassroots stuff is still very important and gains a lot of momentum. And it's not out of the ordinary that some of those things that start off in that very grassroots way have such an impact that they then kind of shift into something new and become part of a bigger diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. And I think that's when I really love to see the synergy, is when, there's kind of both the top down and bottom up approach to this work, because then, to your point, people feel like they have an active role and that their voices are being heard and being a part of that.
Andrea, I just wanted to add, I really love, Ashley, what you told. It's the really small ripples that have a momentous impact at the end of the day. And it's really about the small ripples that really resonated with me.
Yeah. Ashley, do you have anything else? And I'll say, as Ashley's coming off, if you all have any additional questions that you all want to use the Q&A function. I'm trying to watch the chat, but if you will use the Q&A function specifically, that'll help me to monitor that. So if you have any questions for me or the panelists, you can go ahead and drop that in, and we'll use the last few minutes to answer questions. So go ahead, Ashley.
Yeah, thank you. In addition to what Rohini said, I agree, offer to lead a Juneteenth celebration, right? That just happened last week. Offer to lead a Diwali celebration, whatever it may be, remembering that diversity, equity, inclusion is everyone's job, like we discussed, right? And I'm only one person. And so I love having folks who are like raising their hands saying, Ashley, I love this work. I love what you're doing. Can I help? Yes, please. I need the additional assistance, especially when it's only just me for a team of many. And the only other thing I would add to what Rohini mentioned is, if you are a hiring manager, or if you are someone who has decision-making capabilities or have the resources to be a part of the interview panel, that's why I would recommend folks be a part of kind of that space too. What we find is, for candidates from underrepresented groups, specifically Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, we are lacking diversity in our interview panels, right? And what we find is we see a higher number of folks who agree to come to our organization once they see folks that look like them on the panel, right? And we also find that it's important to have that perspective in the room during those interviews. So you raising your hand to even just simply be a part of a 1 hour or 30-minute interview can be monumental in changing the makeup of your organization. Because what we know, the business case, right, is that diverse teams equal higher levels of innovation, higher level of profitability, and a higher sense of belonging for all employees. So you helping to bring on more diverse folks into your organization is huge. So it may seem small, but like we said, small wins are big and are appreciated. And one of my previous chief human resources officers, said, Ashley, it's a small drip, slow drip, from the faucet that really causes the bowl to fill up eventually. It's just going to take some time. And so see this work as a slow drip, and every little bit counts. So don't see anything that you're doing as small. See it as a huge change, a huge momentum shift. And we appreciate any additional support that we can have.
Yeah, I so deeply agree with that. Like, the ability to say, like, yeah, come be a part of this, come join in. And especially in kind of thinking about how do you show up as like an ally to groups that maybe you don't identify with. That is a really great opportunity. So for example, Ashley just talked about, like, hey, maybe it's Juneteenth, or Rohini mentioned Diwali, right? Like, I have never celebrated, with my family Diwali. It's not, but I was had an opportunity that my colleagues said, like, this is something we're interested in doing. And I said, great, let's work on this together. I want to learn more. And I absolutely love Diwali. I love the Festival of Light. Like, I wanted to learn. And that's a big part of the journey. So if you're in the position of DEI, also being willing to be open-minded and constantly learning about what is important to other people and what do they value. And so just because you maybe don't know about, Holi or Diwali or any of these other moments, being able to say, I see the importance, and if that is going to make this particular group feel included and feel seen and valued and like that sense of belonging, then let's partner and let's work on this and have other people have a voice and a seat at the table, because I may not know what I don't know. And so I think that's just really important. So I've got a couple of questions coming in. So thank you all for that. So I'm going to bring up this first one. And for the panelists, whoever wants to start, how do you deal with pushback in your organization and getting blocked when maybe there's something you're trying to do and maybe you're not getting the backing that you want to get? Rohini, you want to start, or Dan?
Yeah, sure. And we've all faced it. There's lack of alignment and within the organization and the vision. So I've had pushback, and the biggest thing that I say is be creative. For me, the point of perspective is it is not a blocker. The point of perspective is, okay, who else can I go to unblock it? There are multiple power entities within your organization. Yes, there is the CEO who has the ultimate power, but guess what? And there are multiple power entities. So I think this is where allyship and advocacy becoming so important. And making sure there's clarity of what you're asking for. That's what it really comes down to. If I were to say, keep it simple. If you were going to your leadership with large budget asks and there's no alignment in the vision, absolutely. If you were to keep it simple, you have an advocate and an ally that's a leader, make sure that you're using that strategy to unblock whatever it is. This is where the power of advocacy comes in. Also, the clarity piece is, what is it that you're asking for from your advocate, right? What is it that you're asking for? Is it just money, or is it really for you to have a voice and opportunity to give a seat at the table so you share your story, or really showing up to whatever you're trying to do? So having that physical presence, be very clear what your ask is.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it kind of goes into this idea of like, how does it fit, right? Like, I like to be really transparent, right? Because Ashley talked about this. Sometimes if you are lucky enough in your organization to even have a D&I person, one singular person, then think of all the things that they are being tasked with in terms of hiring, retention, development. Those, and I mean, I'm using the highest level. And depending on the size of your organization, how many then like factors that go into making an impact on that. So if that one person who doesn't maybe have support is trying to accomplish all of those, when there's additional asks, it may not be that, no, we don't want to do it. It's sometimes a matter of how do we prioritize that ask and how does it fit into this? So my advice for people who are saying like, I want to participate, I want to bring things to the table, is to be able to think about, even at that high level of those three things, where does that fit? Does it fit into the bucket of, I think it will help us hire more people? Does it fit into the bucket of, I think it will create more inclusion and belonging? What is that thing that it's going to help to drive? And if you can talk about the alignment to that and the impact that it could make, that's much more helpful than just like, hey, I want to do a thing, and there may not be a connective tissue to it. So that's just a little bit of advice that I like to give there. And then I'll second that with this other question that came in, kind of like, how do you combat skepticism? And I think it's that same, my answer is really kind of the same, is what is it that you're asking and how does it fit, and being able to kind of put something behind that. And whether that's research, and there's lots of different places on the internet where you can pull research together that says like, here's some examples of maybe what someone else is doing, just as a way to guide, because again, leaders may be at their own place in this journey too. And it may not be the organization for you. If I'm going to be very honest, I'm also seeing a question about like the CEO, how do you, right? If you are seeing from the top that diversity, equity, and inclusion is not a priority, then you have the ability to have to ask yourself that question, like, is this the right place for you as well? Go ahead, Ashley.
I also bring forth the data, right? Start with the facts. And specifically in the US, we're experiencing what they call a cultural demographic shift. And so what that means is those who identify from the minority population will soon be the majority by year 2060, I believe. And that's prevalent today, where those who are under the age of 18, 50% of those folks identify as multiracial, right? And so it's sharing with your leaders that in order for us to be a profitable, innovative business in the future, we need to match the customer communities that we serve. And so that starts with our employee population being a mix and being representative of the US and across the world. Women make up 50% of our global population, right? And so if our employee base is not 50% women, we're not meeting our customer needs, right? And so I really have been focusing on the fact that if we still want to be the #1 innovative company 20 years from now, we need to make the shift today, because everyone else is awake and everyone else realizes that we need to make this change. And so I want us to be on the forefront of that. And I also want to make sure that our organization not only appeals to folks from different backgrounds, but we also are able to retain them. And so that's why I need us to do this Juneteenth celebration or this Diwali celebration, because everyone is hungry for belonging. It's innate in us as humans. And if a small thing such as us recognizing they're part of their culture and taking time out of our day to celebrate it is helpful in that, then we should do it, right? We should just do it.
Yeah, I love that. A couple more questions that are coming in, and we're right at time. So one question that came in: how do you get into your first DEI role? That is a huge question. So that is kind of, I'll pivot a little bit here just to say, you know, if this is something you are seriously thinking about, please do go to my website, AndreaGTatum.com. I offer DEI advisory services and the ability to connect one-on-one to talk about, why do you want to do this work? What are your experiences and what are your skills that you bring to the table in order to best really advocate on your own behalf for a role that you may be applying to. I help people understand that there are so many different roles out there. I mean, just the four of us on here all have very different ways that we work within this space. So kind of understanding what it is that you want to do will be really helpful before you go out and start just applying to every single role that you see. So again, it's AndreaGTatum.com. I'll pull up a little slide for you. And so I'll kind of end on one last question that I saw pop up in here, and it goes back to something we talked about earlier. And I'll start with Dan on this one, and maybe just kind of let each person answer this as your final question. What is one thing in your approach to starting maybe a strategy with an organization, whether you're consulting or internal, where do you like to start on that journey of creating a DEI strategy?
Yeah, this is a great question. So for me, strategy, I feel like, is a buzzword that we all use and often mean very different things. So the first thing for me is really important to understand, what do we actually mean by strategy and what are we hoping it will do? So once we have a shared definition of language, the thing that's most important to me is to create a container in which we can do this work together for the long haul, because as Ashley and Rohini and Andrea have mentioned, this is not something that changes overnight. And so for me, one of the things we focus most on at INW is actually building what we call the container in which this work takes place. And for us, I think about it sort of as the equivalent of, like, I played soccer in high school, and the team would never let me go out onto the field for a match if I hadn't been to practice. And we know in our society, based on the really mismatched educational goals that we experience, we actually don't get an opportunity to practice being in these conversations, and we're not always exposed to these very nuanced topics. And so our container building exercises help us build and practice skills so that we can actually participate in conversations about strategy, about goals, about relationships, about systems, because without that upfront work, we're not setting ourselves up for success. So for me, it's really about thinking about what is the context in which we are doing this work and how do we establish that for success.
Perfect. I love that. Rohini?
Everything Dan said, I'm going to add one thing. What is the narrative? What is the story that we're trying to achieve? So important if you don't know what the narrative and story is. And so I use the art of storytelling as part of strategy while you're building the container. So that's very important, because if your leaders can't even speak to their story and be vulnerable and willing to open up and really go down to, Ashley has mentioned, that connection and be just a human. Strategy is such a big word. We use strategy, and Dan, absolutely, what does it even mean? But I think it's really bringing it down to the basics. So what is the narrative that we're trying to build as we talk about this?
I love Dan's chat over here. He said, I'm a recovering MBA and I still don't know. Ashley, I'll let you wrap this up on your thoughts around strategy. And I love, you've already talked about data, which I absolutely am 100% an advocate for, but I'll let you answer your own question.
Just really quickly, agree with what everyone has said. I'll just add, start with the end in mind. So for us, if the outcome is really dedicated to increasing the representation at all levels of of folks to ensure that we're representative of the customer communities that we serve. That is my strategy. And so I'm going to build everything around that end goal. And I'll leave it at that.
I love it. That is a great place to end on. Thank you again to Rohini, Ashley, Dan. Thank you all so much for giving your voices on this. Again, you can connect with me either on LinkedIn or on my website. It's AndreaGTatum.com. And you can look at my services. So I offer the DEI Career Advisory Services. I also have a on-demand course, and on that course you're able to kind of just learn, like, what does it mean to work in diversity, equity, and inclusion inside of a corporate space? And it answers some of these questions that nobody is maybe out there telling you, and talking about what is able to actually happen depending on the maturity of a company, and thinking about your skills and experiences. So I would be really happy to work with any of you all who are thinking about getting into this space. And I will be posting this video on my YouTube. If you do not subscribe to my YouTube, I will ask that you please do, and make sure that you're also getting my emails. So thank you again all so much for being here today, and have a wonderful rest of your weekend.
Take care, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all.